When Harold Whitmore died after 41 years as a civil engineer, his family divided what he left behind in 4 days. His adult children from his first marriage took the house on Linden Drive, the retirement accounts, and the investment portfolio. They moved fast, the way people move when they have been waiting. Clara Whitmore, his wife of 11 years, was left with a box of her own belongings, a used Buick, and a handwritten receipt for $1. It was payment for the transfer of a boarded-up lakeside property in northern Wisconsin that no one in the family had visited in over a decade. They laughed at the reading. The attorney did not. He called Clara the next morning and told her he would drive her there himself. What they found inside those walls had been sealed for 30 years by a woman Clara had never met. A woman who had left something for her long before Harold had. The reading of Harold Whitmore's will took place on a Thursday morning in late October, in an attorney's conference room with beige carpet and a window that looked out at a parking garage. The attorney's name was Franklin Sauce. He was 72, small and neat with white hair and bifocals on a silver chain, and he had been Harold's attorney for longer than Clara had known Harold. He sat at the head of the table with a folder in front of him and his hands flat on the cover. Clara sat to his right. Across from her sat Derek, Harold's son from his first marriage, who was 44 and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's jaw and an expression that communicated, as it usually did in Clara's presence, a kind of patient waiting for something to conclude. Beside Derek sat his sister Joanna, 39, in a blazer she'd worn to make something clear about the register of the occasion. Next to Joanna was her husband, a man named Paul who had attended every family event in 11 years with the particular quality of a man who was there to keep count. Harold had died of a stroke on a Tuesday, which was the kind of Tuesday that rearranges everything before you have time to understand what's been arranged. Clara had been at the grocery store when it happened. She drove home to find the paramedics in the kitchen. She'd had 11 years of Harold, 11 years of his quietness and his dry humor, and his particular way of reading the newspaper with his glasses pushed up onto his forehead, even though that made no optical sense, and she had lost him between the cereal aisle and the front door. The 4 days between the death and the reading had been managed entirely by Derek and Joanna. They arrived within hours, efficient and organized and fundamentally private about everything they were doing in Harold's study. Clara understood what they were doing. She did not say so. She made coffee and answered phone calls and sat in the room where Harold used to watch football and did not sleep and waited for whatever was coming to arrive. Franklin Sauce opened the folder and read the will in the methodical, unhurried voice of a man who had read many wills and understood that the words needed to land before they needed to be discussed. Harold had been precise. The Linden Drive property went to Derek and Joanna jointly. The retirement accounts divided between them in specified percentages. The investment portfolio transferred to a trust in their names. The car, a newer model, to Joanna. The savings account split per the document. Franklin paused. His eyes moved briefly to Clara. The remaining assets, he said, are as follows. 1 personal effects box, as itemized and set aside. 1 2009 Buick LeSabre, title clear. And 1 transfer receipt for real property located at County Road 7, Lake Perch, Sawyer County, Wisconsin. He set a single sheet on the table and slid it toward her. The transfer receipt was handwritten, 2 lines on a standard form, in a font that meant it had been filled out on a typewriter that still existed somewhere. Transfer of real property from Harold James Whitmore to Clara Ruth Whitmore. Consideration: $1. Joanna said something to Paul in a voice low enough to be almost private and not quite. Derek leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He had a way of doing that, tilting his head back and closing his eyes for a moment, that communicated a kind of resignation to the stupidity of whatever was happening. He'd been doing it since the first dinner Harold brought Clara to, 11 years ago, when Derek had asked Clara what her previous husband had done for a living, and she'd answered that she'd never been married before. And Derek had tilted his head back and closed his eyes for just that beat, as if recalibrating. "What is this property?" Joanna asked Franklin. Franklin folded his hands. "It is a residential property on Lake Perch in Sawyer County. Approximately 40 acres, including a main house, a carriage house, and lake access. It was originally part of the Margaret Whitmore estate." Joanna went still. Margaret Whitmore had been Harold's first wife. She had died 30 years ago of a heart condition, when Derek was 14 and Joanna was 9. They did not discuss her in front of Clara and had not, as far as Clara could determine, discussed her in front of Harold for many years. Her name, when it appeared in a room, had the particular weight of a topic that people have agreed to carry without mentioning. "That property has been in our family since our mother's parents," Derek said. His voice was even, but something had moved underneath it. "It has nothing to do with her. The transfer," Franklin said, "was legally executed 2 years ago. Harold filed it with the county recorder's office. It is registered in Clara's name." Derek looked at Clara. It was not the patient waiting look. It was something with more edge than that. Clara looked back at him. She kept her face steady. She had been keeping her face steady in rooms with Derek for 11 years. She had learned not to offer anything it could be used against. $1, Joanna said. He sold it to her for $1. $1 is a valid consideration under Wisconsin property law, Franklin said. The transfer is valid. It was just a boarded-up house on a lake, Clara said. I didn't even know it was part of the estate. Harold mentioned the property once, years ago. He said it had belonged to Margaret's family and they hadn't done anything with it in years. Nobody in the room believed that was the full story. Clara herself wasn't sure it was, but it was what she had. Derek stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Franklin. We're going to want to contest the transfer. That is your right, Franklin said. Derek looked at Clara once more. Then he left. Joanna and Paul followed. Clara sat in the empty conference room for a moment after they were gone. The transfer receipt was still on the table in front of her. She picked it up. $1. Harold's signature at the bottom, his characteristic looping H and the rest running together in the way of a man who had signed his name to engineering documents for 40 years and let his signature become efficient. She thought about the last 2 years. Harold hadn't been ill, not in any way that showed. He'd been quieter. He'd been spending Sundays in the study more than usual, going through files she'd assumed were work documents. He'd had 2 long phone calls with Franklin that he'd taken in the study with the door closed, which was unusual. He'd known something was coming. She understood that now. She put the receipt in her purse and walked to the parking garage. Franklin called the next morning at 7:30. Mrs. Whitmore, I'd like to drive you up to the property. I think it would be better if I came along the first time. Clara had been standing at the kitchen window watching the neighbor's dog cross the yard. The house smelled like Harold still. Not any specific thing, just him. When? She said. Today, if you're able. He arrived at 9 in a gray Volvo with a heated seat he immediately offered to her and a thermos of coffee on the center console. He drove north for 3 hours through the flat Wisconsin farmland that lifted gradually into rolling countryside and then into the pine-weighted hills of the north. The sky was low and white, the kind of October sky that carries winter in it like a held breath. Franklin said very little on the drive. He answered Clara's 2 questions, once about the property's tax status, which was current, and once about how long he had known about the transfer, which was 2 years. He did not offer more than that. Clara didn't push. She watched the pine trees thicken around the road and the lakes appear and disappear through the trees, gray and cold and still. County Road 7 was a 2-lane blacktop that turned to gravel after the last visible farmhouse. Franklin drove it slowly, and the Volvo's headlights caught pine needles and frost on the grass shoulders. Then the road curved, and he pulled through a gap in a stone wall where a wooden gate stood open. The estate appeared at the end of a long gravel drive. Clara did not say anything for a moment. The house was larger than she'd imagined. A 2-story clapboard with a wide covered porch running the full front, a stone chimney at each end, and windows shuttered and dark. White paint weathered to gray. A carriage house to the left, its doors closed. And beyond everything, through a gap in the trees, the gray shine of lake perch stretching away into the low October sky. It was not ruined. It was waiting. Franklin parked and turned off the engine. He reached into his briefcase and handed Clara an envelope. Harold asked me to give you this when we arrived, he said. Not before. Clara held the envelope. Harold's handwriting on the front, just her name. She didn't open it yet. She got out of the car. The front door opened on the 3rd key Franklin tried. A skeleton key that turned with a sound like something exhaling. Clara stepped through into the still air of the front hall. The house smelled like cold and pine resin and the particular dryness of rooms that have been closed a long time. Dim light came through the gaps in the shutters, striping the floors in pale bars. The floors were wide plank pine, dark with age, solid under her feet. The front hall opened into a parlor on the left and a sitting room on the right, and straight ahead a staircase climbed to the second floor in a wide, unhurried curve. Franklin waited in the doorway. He didn't come inside. "Take your time," he said. Clara walked into the parlor. It was large, with a stone fireplace on the far wall and built-in bookshelves on either side of it. The furniture was draped in white sheets, the shapes of chairs and a settle and a writing desk visible underneath like forms in heavy snow. The windows were shuttered, but one panel had come loose, and afternoon light, thin and gray, fell through the gap and lit a narrow rectangle of floor and wall. On the wall above the fireplace, visible in that strip of light, was a watercolor painting. 12 inches by 18, framed in plain dark wood, hung where it had always been. A view of the lake from the front porch of this house, the water soft and gray-green, the pine trees dark on the far shore, the sky the specific pale blue of a Wisconsin morning in early summer. Clara stood in front of it for a long time. She did not know who had painted it, but she understood immediately that it had been done by someone who loved this particular view. Not a copy, not a representation. A painting by someone who sat on that porch and looked at that water the way you look at something that is yours, in the specific way that the world you choose is yours. She moved through the room. Beneath the window seat on the east wall, a thin sheet still covered the cushion, and on the sill above it, undisturbed, sat a small tin. Clara lifted the lid. Inside, dried lavender, still faintly fragrant, the smell released when she opened the tin like something waiting for permission to be useful again. She breathed it in and held the tin and felt, without fully understanding why, that she had arrived somewhere she was meant to be. On the writing desk under its sheet, when she folded back the cover, she found a music box. Small, dark wood, a painted enamel lid with a blue bird. She lifted the lid. The mechanism turned a few slow notes, a lullaby she almost recognized. 4 or 5 notes before it wound down, not broken, just unhurried, playing what it had left. 3 things. The painting over the fireplace, the tin of lavender on the sill, the music box on the desk. Clara stood in the parlor of a house that had been closed for 30 years and felt the particular quiet of a place where someone was still present in the objects they left. She walked to the bookshelves beside the fireplace. The books were dusty but intact, old volumes in faded cloth covers, poetry and field guides, and a complete set of a novelist she didn't recognize. On the third shelf, a framed photograph. A woman standing at the end of a dock, her back to the camera, looking out at the lake. The water around her was still, and the morning light came from behind the pines. And the woman's arms were loose at her sides and she was completely at rest. Clara did not know if this was Margaret. The photograph was from the back. But the posture had the ease of someone who belonged somewhere completely, and this was the only place Clara could imagine a person belonging that way. She carried the photograph to the window and held it in the thin light. Then she went to the window seat. The cushion, when she pulled it up, exposed a hinged bench seat. Standard storage. Clara lifted the lid. Inside, folded linens, an old wool blanket, some folded paper. She moved them aside. Under the linens, at the far back corner of the bench, her hand found something that didn't belong. Not a box, exactly. A tin, larger than the lavender tin. Flat and rectangular, the kind used for biscuits or toffee in an earlier era. Its lid sealed with a strip of electrical tape that had dried to a crisp. Clara lifted it out and brought it to the window. The tape came away with a dry crack. The lid resisted, then opened. Inside, folded in a piece of cream-colored cloth, was a journal. Navy blue cover, cloth-bound, the kind of journal someone used with intention. Beneath it, a bundle of envelopes tied with white ribbon, and beneath those, a small key, brass, flat, the kind that opened a specific sort of lock. Clara sat on the edge of the window seat and opened the journal. The handwriting was fine and careful, with the particular evenness of someone who was accustomed to putting things into words. The first entry was dated March of 31 years ago, a year before the date Clara later understood to be Margaret's death. I have been thinking about what to do with this place. Not what to do with it practically. That part is easy. The hard part is what to do with everything that happened here. This house has been the best part of my life. I don't want that to disappear. I don't want all of it to sit in the dark and go to nothing. I would like it to find someone. Clara read the page again. Then she turned to the next one. I asked Franklin today what would happen to the property if I left it to Harold with conditions. He said conditions on real property require precise drafting. I said, what if the condition is simply this, that whoever Harold loves when the time is right should have the house? He thought about it for a while. Then he said, I'll draw something up. Clara set the journal down on her knee. Her hands were not quite steady. Outside, through the loosened shutter, she could see the white Volvo in the drive and Franklin's gray figure standing beside it. Patient as he had been all morning, giving her time she hadn't asked for but apparently needed. She thought about the drive. 3 hours with a man who had known this was here and said almost nothing. She thought about Harold in the study those last 2 years, going through files, taking calls with the door closed. She thought about a woman she had never met, sitting in this room 31 years ago, writing in a journal by hand, thinking about what she wanted to leave behind and for whom. Clara stood. She carried the tin to the window and looked out at the lake. The water was still, gray-green in the October light, the same water in the painting above the fireplace, the same water the woman at the end of the dock had been watching in the photograph. The pine trees were dark on the far shore, and the sky was low and white, and the whole scene had the quality of something that had not changed and did not intend to. Clara went to the front door. Franklin, she called. He came to the porch. I think you need to come inside, she said. Franklin came in carefully, as though the house had a threshold that required acknowledgement. He stood in the parlor doorway and looked at the painting over the fireplace, and the sheets pulled from the furniture and the tin on the window seat, and he said nothing for a long moment. Clara showed him the journal. He sat in one of the uncovered chairs, reading glasses on, and turned the pages with the deliberate attention of a man to whom this was not a surprise but was, nevertheless, something he needed to receive properly. She found Margaret's voice in the pages quickly. The journal was not daily. It was periodic, written when something needed recording, the entries sometimes weeks apart and sometimes every 2 or 3 days. Margaret wrote about the lake and about the house and about Harold and the children, and about illness in the careful way of someone who has been given a timeline and is choosing not to spend it on grief. She wrote about what she hoped for. She wrote about what she wanted to leave. Entry from the following August. Harold came up this weekend. We sat on the porch in the evening and didn't say very much, which is how we've always communicated best. I watched him looking at the water and I could see him already practicing the loss. I want him to stop that. I want him to understand that the point isn't to grieve a long time. The point is to have a good life, and to let the people you love have a good life. I'm trying to say that, but Harold hears things through a particular filter. I'll try again. Entry from September. I talked to Franklin. He has drawn up the trust document. The property will go into trust. Harold will have use of it for as long as he wants, and then, when he is ready, or when the right time comes, the property will be available for transfer to whoever he loves. That is the precise language Franklin used, whoever he loves. I like that it's imprecise. It means someone will have to make a judgment call. I trust Harold to make that call. I'm leaving the rest of the instructions in the envelope under the hearth. Franklin knows where it is. Clara looked up. She looked at the fireplace. The hearth was wide, flagstone, the stones fitted tight with old mortar. A raised border of fitted stone ran around the edge. She crossed to it and crouched down and ran her hand along the front row of stones. The third stone from the left moved, not much, just enough. The mortar around it was newer than the rest, or had been replaced at some point, and the stone itself had been reset slightly higher than its neighbors. Franklin, Clara said. He came and stood beside her. He looked at the stone, and then at her, and then back at the stone. I'll need a tool, she said. He went to the car and came back with a tire iron from the trunk. The stone came up on the second try. Beneath it, in a cavity cut into the subfloor, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with a copper wire twist, a second tin, smaller than the first, heavier, with a combination lock. Clara looked at the key in the first tin. Not a combination, a key lock. The second tin had a key lock too, hidden underneath the combination dial. She tried the key. The lid opened. Inside, 3 envelopes, numbered in Margaret's handwriting. 1, 2, 3, and beneath them, folded flat. A document that Clara had to unfold twice before she understood what she was looking at. A deed. Not a copy. The original deed to the Lake Perch property, made out in the name of a trust titled the Lake Perch Living Trust, and attached to it a transfer document executed 11 years ago, the month after Harold and Clara's wedding. transferring ownership from the trust to Clara Ruth Whitmore upon the conditions specified herein, effective upon Harold's death. 11 years ago, the month after their wedding. Harold had known this was here. He had known from the beginning. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the document in her hands. The fireplace was cold. The room was cold, but she felt very still. She opened envelope 1. It was from Franklin, dated 11 years ago. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, if you are reading this, then Harold has passed and the transfer I have been managing for the last decade has come into effect. I want you to know that Harold knew everything about this property and about Margaret's intentions. He chose not to tell you until the right time, and he believed the right time was after. He said you would understand that when you found the letters. I will explain the legal situation when you are ready. There is no urgency. Franklin Sauce. Envelope 2 was from Harold, his handwriting the looping H, the efficient rest. Clara, he wrote. I know this is a strange way to have a conversation. I wanted to tell you about this 100 times. The reason I didn't is the same reason Margaret didn't explain herself to me, not directly. She understood that some gifts need to arrive without explanation because the explanation would change the gift. I trusted her on that. Now I'm asking you to trust me. The house belonged to Margaret's family. She was born in it, more or less. She loved it with a specific and exact love that I have only seen in one other person, which is you. The way you love a garden or a room or a landscape is the same. You see things. You understand what a place means. Margaret saw that in me when we talked about you, and I know that sounds complicated, but it isn't. She just wanted this place to find someone. It found you. Do not let Derek convince you otherwise. He is angry about many things, most of which go back to losing his mother when he was 14. That is real. It is not your problem to solve, but it is worth understanding. He will come at the property. Franklin will help you. Clara, I loved you from a very ordinary Tuesday, and I am sorry I won't be there to watch what you do with this house. I think it will be extraordinary. Harold. Clara folded the letter and held it in both hands and did not try to do anything with what she was feeling. She just held it. She opened envelope 3. This one was older, the paper thin and slightly yellowed at the folds. The handwriting was different, smaller, more precise, the writing of someone who had trained herself to fit more onto a page. Dear whoever you are, it began. I'm writing this under a flagstone in a house I love. That should tell you something about me. I don't know your name. I know you love Harold. I know that because Harold doesn't love lightly or frequently or without excellent reason. If he has let you into his life the way I'm told he has, then you deserve to be here more than most people deserve most things. I want you to have this house, not because it is worth a great deal of money, though it may be, but because it deserves to be lived in by someone who will understand what it is for. It is for sitting on the porch on mornings in June watching the lake change color. It is for the smell of pine and cold water and the particular silence of a place that has been loved for a long time. It is for the painting I couldn't take down even when Harold suggested selling the place years ago. I told him that painting stays where it is. I hope you found it. I hope you understand that I'm not haunting this house. I am simply leaving it to you. What you do with it is yours to decide. But if you ask me, you should keep the coffee on and let people in and not worry so much about what it's worth on paper. That's all I know how to say. Margaret. Clara sat on the cold hearth of a fireplace that had not been lit in 30 years and read that letter 4 times. The afternoon light through the broken shutter moved across the floor as the angle changed. The music box on the desk was still. The lavender tin on the sill held its scent in the cold air. She could hear Franklin moving quietly in the hallway, giving her as much time as this required. She thought about a woman she had never met, who had sat in this room and written a letter to a stranger she would never know, and sealed it under a stone, and trusted that Harold would find the right person in time. He had. Franklin drove her back to the city that evening and called 3 days later, with a briefing that was calm and specific in the way his manner always was. The property was in Clara's name by virtue of the deed and the trust document. The transfer executed 11 years ago was legally valid, predating any claim Derek or Joanna might assert through the estate proceedings. The tax situation was current. Harold had paid the property taxes every year, quietly, without fanfare. There was, however, a complication. The property had been vacant for over a decade, and in Sawyer County, a vacancy of that duration triggered an automatic structural inspection before any change of occupancy permit could be issued. Clara would need to establish that the building was structurally sound before she could legally take up residence. If the inspector found significant deficiencies, she'd have 60 days to remediate, or the county could proceed to a formal condemnation review. Franklin paused. Derek has already filed an intent to contest the transfer, he said. His attorney is claiming the transfer was not properly disclosed at the time of Harold's estate, which is not a sound argument legally, but it will require us to respond. And if the property is condemned before you establish residence, it creates a complicating factor. How long before the inspection? The county scheduled it for 3 weeks from tomorrow. That was all the time she had. Clara said very little on the call. She thanked him. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while, thinking about the 60 days and the inspection and Derek's attorney filing things and what it meant to fight for something you loved before you had even fully arrived. Then she packed a bag and drove north. She moved into the Lake Perch house on a Thursday in early November. She swept the floors and opened the shutters and wiped 3 decades of dust from the window glass. She turned the furnace on, which coughed and rattled, and eventually, after considerable coaxing and a call to a heating company in Hayward, produced warmth. She made up the bed in the largest upstairs bedroom with sheets she'd brought from home. She bought a coffee maker at the hardware store in town and set it on the kitchen counter. The next morning she was on the porch with her coffee when a sound from across the lake caught her attention. The far shore was close enough to see clearly in the winter light, and there was a small house there set among the pines, with a dock extending over the water. On the dock stood a figure in a heavy coat, unmoving, looking across at the estate. Clara raised her hand. After a moment, the figure raised hers back. That afternoon, a green station wagon pulled into the drive. The woman who climbed out was 80 if she was a day, small and purposeful, in a wool coat and rubber boots. She had white hair cut short and a face that had been weathered into something specific and clear, like a stone that a river has finished working on. She stood and looked at the open shutters. The porch swept clear, the smoke from the chimney that Clara had managed that morning on the second attempt. Well, the woman said. Good. Her name was Vera Holm. She had lived in the house across the lake for 53 years. She and her late husband had been friends with Margaret's parents before Margaret was born, and she had watched 3 generations of that family come and go from the house on the West Shore. She came in and sat at the kitchen table and drank Clara's coffee and said what she had to say without preamble. Margaret was the finest person I have known in my life. Not the most accomplished, not the most educated, not the most anything in a way that would make a newspaper story. Just the finest. She understood what things were for. She knew how to be present in a place and why that mattered. She looked at Clara steadily. Harold's children came up here twice after Margaret died, she said. They were teenagers. They didn't know what to do with the place or with their grief, and it frightened them. They locked it and left, and I don't think they came back more than once after that. She paused. Derek blamed Harold for a long time for moving on. Children do that. Clara nodded. When Harold told me about you, Vera said, I was glad. I had been glad for him, and I was glad for this house. She set her mug down. I want you to know that I watched Margaret paint that watercolor. She sat on the porch 3 mornings in a row to get the light right. She was very particular about the light. Clara looked at her. The painting in the parlor? Vera nodded. She painted it for the house, not to take anywhere. She said a house needs at least one thing in it that was made for it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, and the music box was from her mother. She wound it every Sunday morning. She said it was the correct thing to do with a Sunday. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not grief exactly, though it was adjacent to grief, more like recognition. Vera stayed 2 hours. She told Clara about Margaret's parents and about the history of the property. About the logging days when the lake road had been a supply route and the estate had been a stopping place. She talked about winters up here and what the lake looked like when it froze, and the specific silence of the pines in January, which was a different silence from any other silence. When she left, she pressed Clara's hand at the door. You are supposed to be here, she said. That is not me being polite. That is me telling you what I know. Clara stood on the porch and watched the green station wagon make its way back down the drive. The inspector arrived 2 weeks later. He was a county employee named Briggs, deliberate and thorough, who moved through the house with a clipboard and a flashlight and said very little. Clara followed at a respectful distance, watching him check floor joists and window frames and the chimney liner and the foundation corners. He tapped walls and looked at the ceiling and wrote things down. When he was done, he stood in the front hall. "The structure is sound," he said. "Foundation is in excellent condition. Stone was well laid. Roof needs work on the north slope." He looked at his clipboard. "Furnace needs a full service before next winter. I'll note the porch ceiling has some soft wood near the east corner. You'll want to address that." "And the occupancy permit?" Clara said. He wrote on a form and tore off the bottom copy and handed it to her. "Provisional occupancy," he said. "You need the roof and the porch ceiling addressed within 90 days. After that, it's yours." He shook her hand and drove away. Clara stood in the driveway with the form in her hand. Around her, the pine trees were dark and still. The lake was gray through the tree gap, flat and cold. The sky was low. She went inside and called Franklin. "The inspector approved it," she said. "Provisional." He was quiet for a moment. "That complicates Derek's argument considerably. His attorney has been building around the structure being non-habitable. What happens now?" "We continue. Derek will file the full contest shortly. We'll be ready." Clara thanked him and hung up and poured herself more coffee. She stood at the kitchen window looking out at the water. Vera's house was visible across the lake, a light on in the lower window. The next morning, a man from a roofing company in Hayward arrived without being called. He was a compact man named Gary, sunburned in the November way of men who work outside in all weather. He knocked on the porch door and introduced himself, and told Clara he'd heard the place was open, and she might need work done. Earl Macklin's cousin used to come up here with her family, he said. Then seemed to realize he'd said the wrong name. He cleared his throat. "I heard Margaret Whitmore used to help people in a quiet way. My mom was one of them." "What kind of help?" Clara asked. He looked at the lake for a moment. "My parents lost our house when I was 6. We were living in the church hall in Hayward. Margaret brought food 3 times a week for 4 months. Never rang the bell. Just left it on the step. We didn't know who it was for a year." He cleared his throat again. "I'll do the roof at cost." Clara looked at him. "I'm not looking for charity," she said. "I'm not offering it." He met her eyes. "I'm paying a debt that's 30 years overdue. There's a difference." She let him start the following Monday. The work settled into a rhythm the way work does when the people doing it have agreed on what matters. Gary was on the roof by 7 each morning, his crew of 2 working quietly in the cold, stripping the north slope and laying new sheathing and felt before the afternoon light faded. Clara worked inside. She pulled the remaining sheets from the furniture and assessed what could be restored and what needed replacing. The settle in the parlor was solid, the fabric worn but the frame perfect. She recovered it herself with a remnant of wool fabric she found in town, the same blue-gray as the lake in the painting. The kitchen table was scarred pine, enormous, built to feed people. And she cleaned it with oil soap until the grain came clear. Vera came every other day. She brought food and opinions and information about every family in the region whose history touched the estate. She knew things about the property that weren't in any document: the year the porch was rebuilt, the name of the carpenter who had done the wide plank floors, the reason the carriage house was positioned the way it was relative to the prevailing wind off the water. She also brought the occasional person. A retired schoolteacher from Hayward, who arrived one afternoon with a wheel of cheese and told Clara that Margaret had taught her younger brother to read after school for 2 years without ever telling anyone. A man from the township who stopped by to say he'd been the one to mow the grass around the property for 15 years after Margaret died, on his own initiative, because it seemed wrong to let it go completely. Small kindnesses repaid to someone they had never met, because the source of the original kindness was unmistakable. Clara listened to each one. She wrote names in a notebook, not for any practical reason, just because writing things down seemed like the right way to receive them. She understood now why Earl Macklin had kept his journal. The record was not for leverage. It was for honoring the full weight of what had happened. The parlor fireplace worked on the first try once Gary's crew cleaned the chimney. Clara lit it on a Sunday evening and sat in front of it with Margaret's journal and read it through again from the beginning, this time slowly, catching things she'd missed in the first reading. A passage in late October of that last year, I painted the view again this morning. The light was different today, colder, more northern. It occurred to me that a view changes with the light, and the light changes with the season, and if you watch it long enough you come to understand that the view is not fixed, but living. I think that's true of most things I used to believe were fixed. Clara closed the journal and looked at the painting above the fireplace. and thought about the woman who had known how to let things go. She started the cooking stove on a Tuesday. The gas line had been reconnected by the utility in town, and the stove, cast iron and ancient, turned out to be in perfect condition. She made soup that afternoon and left the front door open to let the smell of it carry, and Vera appeared within 40 minutes with bread she claimed she'd already had made. The provisional occupancy permit required the porch ceiling to be addressed. Gary found the soft wood on a Friday morning and had it replaced by noon. He walked Clara through the repair, showing her the rot pattern and what had caused it. Water infiltration from a blocked gutter that had been cleared years ago but left damage behind. "You can see the rest of the structure here," he said, pressing his palm to the new wood and then to the sound old wood beside it. "The good stuff doesn't move." He tapped it. "Solid." He tapped the new wood. "This will match in a year or two. Wood does that. It accepts the new." Clara looked at the porch ceiling and thought about that. She was beginning to feel it herself. The way the house was accepting her. Or she was accepting it, or both things were happening together in the way that can't be separated once you stop trying to analyze it. Vera sat on the porch one evening in late November with her hands around a mug and the lake going dark through the pine gap and said, "This is when the house is most itself. Right here. When it's too cold for strangers to visit and the people who are here have decided to be here." Clara looked at the water. "I found a girl in the boathouse this morning," she said. "I think she's been sleeping there." Vera turned her head. "I left the door unlocked when I was moving things. She's maybe 16. She had a backpack and she was wearing a school jacket that said Hayward across the back." "What did you do?" Clara wrapped both hands around her mug. "I left coffee on the boathouse step. She'd gone by the time I came back to check." Vera was quiet for a moment. "Margaret used to leave things on steps," she said. "I know," Clara said. "She stays close." If you're in this far, stay with me. What Clara found under that hearth is the reason I wanted to tell you this story. If it's sitting with you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The letter from Derek's attorney arrived on a Monday. Clara read it at the kitchen table with her coffee, which had gone cold before she finished. The language was formal and dense and built around three claims: that the trust instrument establishing the Lake Perch property transfer was inadequately disclosed during Harold's estate proceedings, that the consideration of $1 constituted a fraudulent conveyance designed to deprive the estate of a rightful asset, and that the property's current market value, estimated at $680,000 by a hired appraiser, was sufficient to warrant equitable redistribution. $680,000. She called Franklin. He was quiet for a moment after she read him the letter. "They got an appraisal," she said. "They did," he said, "and it's not inaccurate for the current market, but it's irrelevant to the legal argument." "Why?" "Because the transfer was not made from Harold's estate. It was made from a trust that Margaret established 30 years ago, which Harold held the right to execute. The estate does not include what the trust contains. Derek's attorney knows this. Then why file?" Franklin was quiet again. "Because Derek does not want to win a lawsuit, Clara. He wants to make this expensive and difficult enough that you give up. It worked once before." "What does that mean?" He was quiet for a longer moment. "There was another property. From Margaret's estate. A small lake cabin, farther north. Derek filed a similar contest against Harold 12 years ago. Harold was tired and grieving and not in good health, and he let the cabin go rather than fight." Clara looked at the painting over the parlor fireplace from where she was sitting in the kitchen doorway. "He thought he might lose this one too," she said. "He was afraid you would face what he faced," Franklin said. "And he wanted to make sure you had everything you needed before he was gone to face it. That's why he spent 2 years getting the paperwork in order." Clara set the letter down on the table. She thought about Harold in the study with the door closed, taking calls, going through files. A man with a deadline he hadn't announced, building a case for someone who didn't know she needed one. "What do we do?" she said. "We respond," Franklin said. "We file the trust documents, the chain of title, and Margaret's original instruction letter. And Clara, there is one thing in the deep reveal that Derek's attorney doesn't know about yet. The letter in the third envelope establishes Margaret's specific intent. It is not ambiguous. A judge who reads it will understand immediately that this was not a fraudulent conveyance. It was the fulfillment of a 30-year-old instruction from the woman who originally owned the property. When? I've filed the response brief today. The hearing is set for the 3rd week of January." Clara said she understood. She thanked him and hung up. She stood in the parlor with the letter in her hand and looked at Margaret's painting and the lavender tin on the sill and the music box on the desk. And she thought about what it meant to be a woman alone in a house in northern Wisconsin in December, fighting for something that a dead woman had left her, because she believed it would find the right person. She decided she was the right person. Derek called that evening. He called on the house phone, which Clara hadn't known existed until it rang, an old wall phone in the kitchen that she'd assumed was disconnected. Clara, his voice was the one he used in rooms that required composure. Derek, he wanted to talk without attorneys. He said that as though it were a concession. "I'm listening," Clara said. He said he was not trying to be unreasonable. He said the property had been in his mother's family, and he had grown up knowing it, and there was a history there that Clara couldn't be expected to fully appreciate. He said he was willing to consider a settlement if she was willing to discuss a fair price. She said, quietly, that she wasn't interested in a settlement. He said, still composed, that she was making this more difficult than it needed to be. She said she understood he had complicated feelings about his mother and about anyone who came after her. She said she respected that, as she had respected it for 11 years. She said she was sorry for what he had lost when he was 14, and she meant it. He was quiet. And then she said, "Your mother left this property for me, Derek, not as a technicality. She left it deliberately for whoever your father loved next. She wrote a letter and sealed it under the hearthstone and trusted Franklin to make sure it got where it was meant to go." He said nothing. "She left this to me because she wanted the house to be lived in by someone who would understand what it was for." She paused. "I am going to understand what it is for. I am already starting to." She heard his breathing on the line. "I'll see you at the hearing," Clara said, and she set the phone on the cradle. She went to the porch and sat in the cold dark with her coffee and listened to the lake, which was frozen now at the edges, the ice building out from the shore in a thin shelf. Vera's light was on across the water. Clara thought about Derek at 14, standing in this house after his mother died, not knowing what to do with himself or his grief or the place she'd left behind. She thought about how long he'd carried that, how it had hardened into something he couldn't examine anymore. She was not angry at him. She was sad for him, in the specific way you can be sad for someone whose pain has turned into your problem. She went back inside and opened Margaret's journal to the last entry, dated 6 weeks before Margaret's death. "I am not afraid of what comes next. I am only afraid that the things that mattered here will not know where to go. I am trying to arrange it so they have somewhere to go. That is all anyone can do, really. Leave things for the right people and trust that the right people will find them." Clara closed the journal and set it beside the music box on the desk. She left the porch light on that night for no particular reason except that it seemed right. In the morning, there was a thermos of coffee on the boathouse step, returned from wherever Abby had left it. A note on a torn receipt, "Thank you." The handwriting was careful and young. Clara left the boathouse unlocked. Vera arrived on a Wednesday morning with something wrapped in newspaper under her arm. She set it on the kitchen table without announcement and poured herself coffee and sat down, which was her method of indicating that something significant was about to happen. Clara sat across from her. "You told me a girl has been sleeping in the boathouse," Vera said. "Yes. Do you know her name yet?" "Abby. I've only seen her twice. She's been leaving the thermos back each time." Vera unwrapped the newspaper. Inside was a photograph, larger than the one upstairs in the parlor, a formal portrait in a wooden frame. A family of 4, a woman, a man, and 2 children. A teenage boy and a girl of about 10. They were standing on the front porch of a house that Clara recognized as this one, in summer, the light coming off the lake behind them. The woman in the photograph was the same woman whose back she'd seen at the end of the dock in the upstairs portrait. But here, face forward, she was clear. 30 or 35, dark hair. A way of standing that communicated ease and pleasure in the particular company of the people around her. "Margaret," Vera said simply. "And that's Derek," Clara said. "The teenage boy. The girl is Joanna." Vera looked at the photograph. "That was the summer before Margaret died. She asked my husband to take it. She said she wanted a family portrait while everyone was still the right age." Clara studied the girl Joanna at 10, squinting into the sun with her father's arm around her shoulders. "They were happy here," Clara said. "They were." Vera set the photograph on the table between them. "I want to tell you something about this property that isn't in any of the documents you found." Clara waited. "The family that owned this estate before Margaret's parents," Vera said, "was a family named Harlan. They ran a logging operation. They had money for a while and then they didn't. And when they couldn't keep the estate going, Margaret's father bought it at a very low price. It was understood at the time that the Harlan family needed the sale, not the amount. She wrapped both hands around her mug. The Harlan family had 2 children, a son and a daughter. The daughter left the region. The son stayed. He worked various jobs for decades, had a family, had a granddaughter. She looked at Clara. Clara looked back. "Abby," she said. Vera nodded. "She doesn't know," Vera said. "She probably doesn't know any of it. Her mother left some time ago, I understand. The girl has been on her own." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Margaret's family bought this house from Abby's family," she said. "At a fair price." Vera said. "The Harlans were not cheated. But the fact remains that this property has a history with that family. And Margaret knew it." Clara opened the journal to a page she had marked with a ribbon. She had not understood the entry when she first read it, but she'd marked it because it felt like it was about something specific. The entry read, "I think often about the Harlans. They were here before us, and they will outlast us in some form. The land holds these things. I hope when this place eventually finds its person, that person will hold it with awareness of what came before. That is all I would ask of anyone who inherits anything." Vera looked at the journal. "She knew," Clara said. "She knew," Vera agreed. Clara stood and carried her coffee to the window. The lake was frozen solid now, the ice opaque and white, the pine trees dark on the far shore. A crow crossed the sky above the water. She thought about a family that had once owned this place, and a woman who bought it knowing the history, and a girl sleeping in the boathouse 50 years later, not knowing any of it. She thought about the letter under the hearthstone, and the instruction it contained, and what it meant that the instruction had led here. That afternoon, Clara walked to the boathouse. She didn't call out. She knocked on the side of the building the way you knock on a door that belongs to someone, even when it belongs to you. She heard nothing. She waited a moment and then went in. The boathouse was empty, but it had been used. A sleeping bag laid flat on an old cot near the back wall, a backpack leaning against the cot's leg. A school jacket folded on top of the bag with Hayward across the back. A library book on the cot beside the pillow, which Clara noted because it was a specific detail about a person that in whatever situation she was in, she was still getting books from the library. Clara left a note on the cot. "You're welcome to sleep here as long as you need to. My name is Clara. I live in the house. Come knock if you're cold or hungry." She went back inside and made dinner. Abby knocked on the kitchen door at 7 that evening. She was lean and guarded and wearing 3 layers, with the specific quality of composure that comes from having survived things without showing anyone that it cost you. She stood in the doorway and looked at Clara with dark eyes that were very like a photograph Clara had seen of a family standing on a porch in summer. "Come in," Clara said. "I made soup." Abby came in. They ate together at the kitchen table. Abby ate with the focused attention of someone who was hungry and had learned not to apologize for it. Clara asked nothing about her circumstances. She passed bread and refilled the bowl and talked about the lake and about Vera across the water and about the house and what she'd been doing to it. Abby listened. She looked at the parlor doorway, the glimpse of the painting above the fireplace, the music box on the desk. "How long have you been out here?" Clara asked eventually. 6 weeks. The answer came without defense. Just a fact. "Where before that?" Abby looked at the table. "Different places." Clara nodded. "Is there someone who knows where you are?" A long pause. "No." Clara wrapped her hands around her mug. "The boathouse has a heater. I had the propane connected last week." She paused. "You'd be warmer in the spare room upstairs." Abby looked up. "I'm not asking you to explain anything," Clara said. "I'm telling you the room is there." Abby said nothing for a moment. She looked at the painting in the parlor. Then she said, "Who painted that?" "A woman named Margaret," Clara said. "She lived here. She painted it to stay. It's good." Abby's voice had some warmth in it for the first time. "She's a good painter." "Yes," Clara said. She was. After dinner, Abby helped clear the table without being asked. She washed her bowl at the sink and dried it and put it back in the cabinet, the action of someone who understood that in other people's spaces you cleaned up after yourself. At the door, she paused. "The room upstairs," she said. "Is it the one with the window over the lake?" "Yes," she nodded, once, and went back to the boathouse. But her steps on the path were lighter than they'd been when she arrived. The following morning, Her backpack was in the upstairs room. Clara woke on the day of the January hearing in the dark, as she had been waking most mornings since she moved in. Before the sky was light, with the particular clarity of a person who has been sleeping well and therefore wakes with their mind already running. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while the darkness over the lake went from black to gray to the early thin light of January in the north. She thought about Harold in the study. She thought about Margaret at the hearthstone, placing a tin in the floor and trusting it to the future. She thought about Franklin, 72 years old, driving 3 hours on a cold October day to bring a woman to a house because he had promised a dead woman he would. She thought about what it meant to be part of a chain of things that had begun before her and would continue after. She heard Abby's door open upstairs. Footsteps on the stairs. The girl appeared in the kitchen doorway in her school jacket and a wool hat, her hair loose. She looked at the coffee maker. "Help yourself," Clara said. Abby poured a mug and stood at the window beside Clara. They looked out at the lake together, the ice flat and white, the pine trees dark on the far shore. The sky doing what it was doing with the January light. "That's beautiful," Abby said. "It is," Clara said. They stood there a while without talking. Franklin drove Clara to the hearing in the gray Volvo, the same car he had brought her up in 3 months before. The courthouse was in Hayward, a brick building on Main Street with American flag out front in the January wind. Franklin was dressed in his dark suit and carried his briefcase with the 3-document folder inside, the same calm he brought to every room that required it. Clara wore Margaret's color, a wool blazer the gray-green of the lake in the painting, which she had not planned deliberately but understood when she put it on. They arrived 20 minutes early. Derek was already there with his attorney, a man named Prescott, who had the confident posture of someone accustomed to winning things on procedure. Derek sat beside him and looked at the table when Clara came in. He did not make eye contact. Joanna was not there. The judge was a woman named Halverson, in her 60s, with reading glasses on a chain, and the settled manner of someone who had been in this courtroom for a long time and had long since stopped being surprised by human behavior. Prescott presented Derek's case first. He was organized and direct. He argued 3 points: that the trust transfer had not been properly disclosed to the estate, that the $1 consideration established a fraudulent conveyance under Wisconsin statute, and that the property's fair market value warranted equitable redistribution to Harold's heirs. When he finished, Judge Halverson looked at Franklin. Franklin opened his folder. He placed the trust instrument on the table first. The original, dated 30 years ago, drafted and witnessed by Franklin himself, establishing the Lake Perch property in a revocable trust with Harold Whitmore as trustee and specifying the conditions of transfer. He explained the chain of custody. The trust, properly registered with the county, had existed independently of Harold's estate. The estate and the trust were not the same legal entity. The $1 transfer was not a fraudulent conveyance because it was not a transfer from the estate. It was the fulfillment of instructions Harold had received 30 years earlier from the trust's creator. He placed the deed next, the original, and the transfer document executed 11 years ago. Then he set the 3rd document on the table. This, he said, is a letter from Margaret Whitmore, dated 30 years and 4 months ago, sealed under the hearthstone of the Lake Perch property at the time of her death, and recovered by my client upon her first visit to the property. Prescott looked at his notes. He opened his mouth. Judge Halverson raised a hand. "Let me read it," she said. Franklin slid the letter across to her. She put on her glasses and read it. All of it. The short lines, the specific language, the signature at the bottom. She read it twice. The courtroom was very quiet. When she set the letter down, she looked at Prescott. "The trust instrument predates the marriage," she said. "The property was never part of the marital estate by statute or practice. The $1 consideration is legally sufficient and was explicitly stipulated in the trust's execution instructions. Is that correct?" Prescott said, with the careful tone of a man reformulating his position in real time, that the disclosure issue remained relevant. The judge looked at him over her glasses. "What wasn't disclosed?" Prescott said the transfer should have been registered in the estate inventory. The judge looked at Franklin. Franklin explained that a trust asset is not an estate asset and is not required to appear in an estate inventory under Wisconsin probate law, and that this principle had been established in case law for 40 years. The judge looked at Prescott again. "Is there anything in your brief that addresses that?" she asked. There was a pause that was approximately 3 seconds long but felt considerably longer. Prescott said there was not. The judge took off her glasses and set them on the papers in front of her. This property was conveyed in a valid trust instrument by its original owner. The trust was properly registered. The terms were properly executed. The consideration was legally sufficient. The estate has no claim to what the trust contains. She looked at Derek. Mr. Whitmore, your mother left this property in trust with specific instructions about where it should go. Those instructions have been followed. This court is not going to override what your mother decided. Derek looked at the table. Motion denied. The Lake Perch property belongs to Clara Whitmore. This matter is closed. She gathered her papers and left the bench. Prescott began assembling his documents without particular haste, the methodical packing up of a man managing his departure. Derek sat for a moment without moving. Then he stood and buttoned his jacket. He looked across the courtroom at Clara. She looked back at him. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was different from his courtroom voice, quieter, not composed in the same way, "She never showed me the journal. She never told me about the trust. She never said any of it." Clara met his eyes. "She didn't tell you," Clara said, "for the same reason she didn't sign it dramatically or make it a speech. Because that wasn't how she did things." Derek looked away. He found something to look at in the middle distance of the room, the wall, the window, some point that wasn't anything in particular. He stood there for a moment. Then he said, "She loved this place." His voice was careful around the words, the way you're careful with something fragile. "I know," Clara said. "I can feel it in everything she left there." Derek looked at her for one more moment. His expression was not the patient waiting expression. It was something else, something less managed. Then he walked out. Prescott followed him. The courtroom was empty except for Clara and Franklin. Franklin closed his briefcase. He looked at Clara. He put out his hand. She shook it. "Shall we?" he said. They walked out into the January cold, the wind coming down Main Street with the specific efficiency of Wisconsin winter, and Franklin unlocked the Volvo and turned on the heated seats and drove north toward the lake. They didn't talk much on the drive. Clara watched the landscape go by, the fields white and flat, the farmhouses set back from the road with their lights already on in the early afternoon dark. At County Road 7, Franklin slowed and turned through the stone wall gap and drove the long gravel drive to the house. The porch light was on. Clara had left it on when she left in the morning. Through the kitchen window she could see the warm yellow light and the shape of someone moving Abby, making something at the stove. Franklin stopped the car and turned off the engine. He sat for a moment. "She trusted you," Franklin said. "Margaret, she trusted Harold. And Harold trusted me. That is a long chain to have held for 30 years. You held it," Clara said. He looked at the house for a moment. The light on the porch, the light in the kitchen, the smoke from the chimney. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I did." He turned the key and the Volvo's engine came back to life. Clara got out and stood in the cold, watching the gray car make its way back down the drive, the headlights disappearing through the pine trees one at a time. She turned to the house. It was dark except for the lights inside and the porch light, and the square glow of the kitchen window where Abby stood in the yellow warmth of the stove. Above the house, the January stars were hard and clear. Clara climbed the porch steps. She opened the front door. The house breathed warmth over her, and inside it smelled like coffee and pine and something Abby was cooking that Clara couldn't identify yet, but was going to. She was home. The days after the hearing had a quality Clara had not expected. Not triumph, not relief exactly, though both were present in some measure. Something quieter. A settling. The way a house settles after a storm, not damaged, just adjusted, finding the level it was always going to find. She called Joanna. She hadn't planned the call. She picked up the phone on a Saturday morning and dialed the number she'd had for 11 years and used rarely. Joanna answered on the second ring with the careful voice of someone who was expecting a version of this moment and wasn't sure which version it would be. Clara said she wasn't calling about the hearing. She said she wanted Joanna to know that if she ever wanted to come to the estate, she was welcome. The door was open. Joanna was quiet for a moment. She asked about the painting in the parlor. Clara described it. The view of the lake, the morning light on the water, the pine trees on the far shore. The way it had been hung for the house, not to take anywhere. Joanna said, softly, that she remembered it. Clara said she thought Joanna would. They did not talk long, but when they hung up, something had been opened that had been closed for 11 years, and both of them knew it. Abby enrolled in school in January. She did it herself, took the bus into Hayward and went to the district office and asked what she needed to bring. She came home with a form that required a guardian's signature and set it on the kitchen table in front of Clara without comment. Clara signed it. The school was 20 miles away and the bus came at 6:50. Abby was up before 6 without being asked, which told Clara something about her that no form would have revealed. She made her own breakfast, cleaned up, and was on the drive at 6:45. She came home in the afternoon with a library book and went upstairs and read until dinner. She was a private person. Clara respected that. She asked questions when she had them and otherwise gave Abby the same thing she herself had needed when she came here, space to arrive on her own terms. One evening Abby came downstairs with her library book and sat in the parlor beside the fireplace. She looked at the bookshelves. "Are these yours?" she said. "They were Margaret's," Clara said from the other chair. "You can read any of them." Abby stood and looked along the spines. She pulled out a volume of poetry, old, cloth-covered, the kind that required a decision. She took it to the chair and opened it and read with the focused stillness of someone who had been a reader for longer than her circumstances had made easy. Vera adopted Abby as a project, which was Vera's word for anything she cared about. She arrived on Tuesday afternoons and brought food and sat at the kitchen table and asked Abby direct questions about her interests and her plans, the way elderly women who have had interesting lives are permitted to do. Abby answered her, which Clara noted, because Abby didn't answer most people's questions with any real information. She told Vera she was interested in architecture. She said it carefully, the way you say something you've been keeping private, not sure of the reception. Vera said, without pause, that Margaret's father had studied architecture in Chicago before coming back to the estate. She said there were drafting tools in the carriage house that had been his. Abby looked at her. Clara went with her to the carriage house the next morning. They opened the wide doors and found what was inside: an architectural drawing table, a flat file cabinet full of plans and drawings, and a set of drafting tools in a wooden case, still sharp, still usable. Abby stood at the drawing table and ran her hand across its surface. "This is real," she said. "It is," Clara said. Abby opened the flat file and looked through the drawings inside. Plans for buildings that had been designed, but Clara didn't know if they'd ever been built, in the careful ink lines of a man who had understood structure. Abby looked at them the way she looked at the poetry book, with complete absorption. She started spending Saturday mornings in the carriage house. Franklin came in February for dinner. The first time he had been to the estate for any purpose other than legal business. He arrived in the gray Volvo with a bottle of wine and the slightly formal manner of a man attending something that mattered to him. Clara had made the enormous kitchen table into a proper dinner table. Vera came. Abby came down from upstairs in a sweater she'd borrowed from Clara's closet without asking, which Clara had noticed and not mentioned. Gary the roofer came with his wife, who had her own stories about the estate and about Margaret and about what the place had meant to people in the region. They sat around the table that had been built to feed people, and they ate and talked, and the kitchen was warm and the fire was going in the parlor, and outside the February dark pressed against the windows. Franklin, near the end of the evening, said something into a pause in the conversation that Clara thought about afterward for a long time. Margaret said once that a house is only as good as the life lived inside it. She paused, wrapping his hands around his wine glass. I think she would find this satisfactory. Clara looked around the table. Vera, weathered and sharp and present. Abby, reading the spine of a book she'd brought down from upstairs. Gary and his wife, easy in the company of people they'd just met. Franklin, precise and kind and old. She thought about a woman who had painted a view of the lake and sealed a letter under a hearthstone and trusted a chain of people she mostly would never know. She poured more wine into Franklin's glass. "I'll keep the coffee on," she said. He smiled. It was enough. 6 months after the hearing. The dogwoods along County Road 7 were white with spring blossoms, and the lake was open again, the ice pulled back to the shores through March and April, the water running free and dark in May. Clara sat on the porch in the morning light with her coffee. Abby was in the carriage house. She had been there since 6. Clara could hear, faintly, the sound of pencil on paper, which was the sound of a person making something. Across the lake, a light moved in Vera's kitchen window. Franklin had sent a note the week before. short, formal, the way his notes always were. He mentioned that Derek had called him. That Derek had asked about the photograph, the formal portrait of the family on the porch, the one Vera had brought. He asked if he could have a copy made. Clara had sent him the original. She had kept the photograph upstairs by the window, but she understood that it belonged to him in a way that photographs belong to the people in them, and that keeping it because the house felt like hers to keep it in was the wrong kind of keeping. She sent it with a note that said only, "She loved this place. So will I." She hadn't heard back yet. She didn't need to. The estate was alive in the way a house comes alive when the right number of people are using it correctly. Vera brought people through in the way that older women bring people places, purposefully, without excessive explanation. Gary had started a repair project on the carriage house roof that Abby was helping with on weekends, learning the vocabulary of structure from a man who knew it with his hands. Clara had started a notebook of her own. Not like Earl Macklin's ledger, not like Margaret's journal, but something between them. Names and small facts. The woman who stopped by with a casserole and told her about Margaret's kindness to her father. The man from the township who had mowed the grass for 15 years and came finally to have a cup of coffee and meet whoever had inherited the task of caring for the place. The stories were accumulating, a record of what this house had been and was becoming. She wrote in it every evening. She left it on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker. The painting above the parlor fireplace caught the morning light at 7, the same light that had been coming through that window for 100 years, the same lake beyond the porch, the same pine trees on the far shore. Some places hold what happens in them, not as memory, but as character, as the thing they become from being used well, over time, by people who understood what they were for. Clara set her coffee cup on the porch rail. Some things outlast us not because they were built to last, but because they were built to be filled. The lake was still. The light was good. She went inside and left the door open.